Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Fudge, and Secretary Buttigieg. Welcome to both of you. The topic of today's hearing is an important one. It's infrastructure. A week ago, I met with President Biden and a group of my Republican colleagues to discuss a potential bipartisan infrastructure package. Secretary Buttigieg was there. It was a constructive meeting, and I'm encouraged by the president's apparent willingness to negotiate with Republicans. I would suggest that there should be three features of an infrastructure package if it's going to have broad bipartisan support. First, it should responsibly boost support for real, that is to say, physical infrastructure. That's the platforms that we share, the platforms and systems that we use to move peoples and goods and services throughout our economy. Those are things that most Americans understand to be infrastructure. Things like roads and bridges and ports and airports and transit. Second, a package that we agreed to cannot undo the 2017 tax reforms that helped create the best economy of my lifetime. Remember, before COVID, just a little over a year ago, we were experiencing an almost unprecedented economic boom. We had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, all-time record low unemployment for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, many other subsets of our population. We had more job openings than there were people looking for jobs. We had record low poverty rate. We had wages growing across the board, but they were growing fastest for the lowest income workers. So this economy was narrowing the income gap while it was performing at a spectacular pace. I'm suggesting it'd be a good thing to get back to the best economy of my lifetime. So we won't get there if we undo the tax reform that helped us achieve that. Third, we should not pay for a big infrastructure package by borrowing or printing hundreds of billions of more dollars. Now, the good news on this front is we have hundreds of billions of unspent COVID-related legislated funds that Congress can repurpose to pay for the infrastructure. According to CBO, over $700 billion just of the Democrats' March so-called COVID bill won't be spent even by the end of this year. And in fact, the Biden administration has already begun repurposing unneeded excess COVID funds from previous bills. HHS has diverted $1.7 billion that was originally meant for COVID, and they're using that instead for unaccompanied minors at the border. So what Congress should not do is simply go on a spending binge of more taxpayer dollars on a liberal wish list that expands the welfare state. Let's take housing, for example. The Biden administration is now proposing almost $250 billion for housing in an infrastructure plan. So first of all, let's be clear. Housing is housing. Housing is not infrastructure. Of course, people need houses. They also need food and clothing and education and healthcare. That doesn't mean that every human need is infrastructure. It's not. We can reach an agreement on infrastructure. But they want to spend, the administration that is, $250 billion on top of the fact that just this past March, that was 2 months ago, they spent $32 billion for housing. And that came after Congress had provided, over the course of last year, $80 billion for housing, which itself was on top of the roughly $50 billion we spend annually on HUD alone, not to mention the billions we spend on other housing programs. If you've lost track of all the tens of billions of dollars, it's because it's really hard to keep it straight. It's a staggering amount of money. It's a similar story on the administration's transit proposal. The Biden administration wants to spend another $85 billion for transit as part of this infrastructure bill. That would come after the Democrats in March spent $30 billion for transit, which itself came after $40 billion last year for transit. And that was on top of the $13 billion that we annually spend on transit. So in case you weren't using a calculator to keep track, that's $83 billion that Congress spent on transit just over the course of 1 year. That number actually exceeds the annual operating and capital costs combined of every single transit agency in America for a full year. Well, our Democratic colleagues point to a decline in ridership, but ridership didn't drop to zero. And if it had, we'd have to ask ourselves whether we should be throwing all this money at a system that has no riders, right? And in addition, state and local governments ought to have some responsibility for this. And we sent them $850 billion on top of last year's all-time record high collection of revenue. Some of the provisions in this in the administration's so-called infrastructure plan are so unrelated, completely unrelated to infrastructure, that it's hard to even consider them with a straight face. $400 billion to expand Medicaid, $100 billion in consumer subsidies and rebates to purchase electronic vehicles. The list goes on and on. Only 6% of the administration's $2.2 trillion so-called infrastructure plan actually goes to roads and bridges. So this kind of excessive government spending is not sustainable. It's contributing to inflation that is already with us. That inflation is essentially an extra tax that all of our constituents have to bear when they buy any of the things they need in life. And none of this should come as a surprise. Even President Obama's Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, warned us of the negative inflationary risks of excessive spending. And he was issuing that warning about the Democrats' bill in March, which at $1.9 trillion he thought was much too big. They passed it anyway, and now our Democratic colleagues are coming back to spend literally trillions more. Let me end where I began. In my view, I do think it's possible for us to enact a bipartisan bill that responsibly boosts federal support for real physical infrastructure. And if all sides are willing to negotiate in good faith, I think an agreement can be struck. But I hope we will focus on that real infrastructure that our economy and society needs, and do it in a responsible fashion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.